Your driveway is community property. That's what Karen from the HOA shrieked one morning, standing there in her robe like she owned half the block. My response was simple: my property, my rules. And that was the moment the war truly began. See, every day I'd roll up my garage door only to find Karen's beige Camry or her husband's bulky SUV planted squarely across my driveway. Not just nudging the edge, but fully barricading me in as if I were a prisoner on my own land. The HOA brushed it off. The police said it was a civil matter, and Karen kept smirking as though her entitlement was law. The final straw: my son Leo missed the first half of his championship soccer final, watching helplessly as his team fell behind because we were trapped at home. That was it. No more notes, no more cones, no more polite requests. If Karen wanted a battle, I was ready to drop the boom literally. Before we jump into this HOA showdown, leave a comment with your city and the local time. Let's see where and when you're tuning in. The first time it really sank in that Karen wasn't just inconsiderate but flat-out hostile. I was already running late for work. The sun had barely burned through the Arizona haze when I hit the garage opener, coffee sloshing in one hand, briefcase in the other. My sensible sedan eased down the incline of my driveway and then slammed on the brakes. There it was again, Karen's beige Camry sitting perpendicular across the mouth of my driveway like some smug troll guarding a bridge. My heart sank, then surged with rage. "Unbelievable," I muttered, palm hitting the steering wheel. I gave the horn a blast that rattled my own windows, probably violated 6 HOA ordinances, and drew exactly 0 reaction. Curtains in her house didn't so much as twitch. That's the thing about Karen, her greatest superpower was pretending not to hear, not to see, not to care. I stormed up her walkway, the one lined with petunias, so perfect they looked like plastic, and pounded on her door. "Karen, your car," I shouted between hammering the bell. After an eternity that stretched my blood pressure to unsafe heights, the door cracked open. There she was in a fluffy robe, fake surprised voice, syrupy as poisoned honey. "Oh, Michael, is everything all right? My name isn't Michael. It never was." But Karen had decided that was my name, and that was that. "Everything is not all right," I growled. "Your car is blocking my driveway." Again. Her eyes fluttered like she was auditioning for a soap opera. "Oh, silly me. I just popped in for coffee and lost track of time. I'll move it right away." Her definition of right away meant a 5-minute spectacle of shuffling into slippers, jingling keys, checking mirrors 17 times, and inching backward as if she were parking the space shuttle. By the time I finally peeled out tires squealing, I was already drafting apologies in my head to my boss. But here's the thing that wasn't a one-off. That wasn't Karen having a distracted morning. That was the opening act of a show that would run daily. Sometimes it was the Camry, sometimes her husband Todd's SUV, but the plot never changed. I'd be late, furious, trapped. She'd be smug, dismissive, untouchable. At first, my wife Maya tried to play diplomat. "Just talk to her," she urged. "Maybe she doesn't realize how much it bothers you." So I did, again and again. Each time Karen widened, her eyes cooed an apology, and went right back to treating my driveway as her personal valet zone. Then came the notes. First polite: "Please don't block the driveway, thanks, Ethan." I found it crumpled in her recycling bin. Then firmer: "This is my private property. Do not park here again." That earned me a comment shouted over the hedge about my ugly lawn edging. Imagine that my grass borders were more offensive to her than her hijacking my driveway. So I tried cones. Bright orange, heavy-duty traffic cones planted like soldiers guarding the entrance. They worked for 2 days. Then I came out one morning to find them stacked neatly on my lawn, Karen's car parked smugly in their place like she'd won a trophy. I called the cops once, after being blocked for nearly an hour, on my way to a doctor's appointment. 2 officers arrived, looking tired, before they even got out of their cruiser. They knocked on Karen's door, got the wide-eyed "oops, I forgot" routine, and gave her a gentle warning about blocking access. Then they shrugged at me. "It's a civil matter, sir. Unless she refuses to move while we're here, there's not much we can do." I even called a tow truck, desperate for relief. The dispatcher sighed like I was the 1,000th guy that day, asking, "It's private property, then no, we can't touch it. Liability, you understand. The HOA, forget it." I went to meetings, sent emails, handed over photos. Their response, a boilerplate letter about neighborly harmony. They told me parking disputes on private driveways weren't in their purview. Unless her car leaked oil on my concrete, their hands were tied. So there I was, stuck in a suburban purgatory where my own driveway was held hostage by a woman with too much entitlement and too little conscience. And then came the Saturday that broke me. It was Leo's big day, the city finals, his team fighting for the championship. Kickoff at 9 sharp, we had to leave by 8. He was buzzing with nerves already in his bright orange goalie gloves when I hit the garage opener. And there it was, Todd's SUV, a tank on wheels, parked diagonally across not just my driveway but half the sidewalk. My throat went dry. I rang the bell, knocked until my knuckles ached. Nothing. The TV was on inside. I could hear the faint rumble of a game show, but no one came. I called the police again. Non-emergency line this time. They said they'd dispatch someone when available. Not exactly comforting. Leo tugged my sleeve, eyes wide. "Dad, we're gonna be late. We'll figure it out," I said through clenched teeth. But we didn't. At 8:40, Karen finally strolled out, tennis racket in hand, cheerfully announcing she needed to borrow the SUV spot. Todd followed minutes later, climbing in casually. They drove off, leaving us scrambling, furious, already too late. We arrived at the field halfway through the match. Leo's team was down by 2 goals. He played like a lion in the second half, but they lost. Watching his face crumple, watching the tears he tried so hard to hide it, lit something in me. That was the day the line wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. Notes hadn't worked, cones hadn't worked. Cops, tow trucks, HOA, all useless. Karen thrived on loopholes and weaponized oopsie smiles. But the universe has a funny way of dropping answers into your lap. A few days later, I pulled into a hospital parking garage for a routine checkup, blood pressure already sky high thanks to my driveway wars. At the exit booth, the barrier arm descended smoothly behind me with a mechanical clunk. Secure, impassable, impersonal. My eyes locked on that striped arm, and something clicked. That was it. No more begging. No more hoping Karen would magically grow a conscience. I didn't need her cooperation. I didn't even need the HOA's approval. All I needed was steel concrete and a motorized arm that would swing down with authority every single time. Could you even install one of those on a residential driveway? I didn't know. But the seed was planted. That night, I went down a rabbit hole of access control systems, loop sensors, photo eyes, remotes, safety beams. I read city ordinances, HOA bylaws, and case law on property rights until 2 in the morning. And the more I read, the more I realized something shocking. There wasn't a single line anywhere that said I couldn't. Karen had her entitlement. The HOA had its useless letters. But I had an idea. A crazy, expensive, brilliant idea. And I was ready to lower the boom. The memory of Leo's crushed expression after that soccer final haunted me for days. I could still see him tugging at his gloves, trying to hide his disappointment while forcing a brave smile. That night when I tucked him into bed, he whispered, "Dad, it wasn't your fault." But it was. Not because I wanted Karen's behavior, but because I had failed to stop it. Every missed opportunity, every oops from her lips, every useless HOA letter, it had all piled up into one crushing defeat for my boy. That was the moment I swore I wouldn't let it happen again. The very next morning, as I sipped bitter coffee and stared out at my still-blocked driveway, I began documenting everything with a new level of obsession. Time-stamped photos of Karen's car blocking me in, screenshots of emails to the HOA, copies of every fine notice, even a notebook where I logged every confrontation, every excuse, every wasted morning. If Karen wanted to play this as a war of attrition, then fine, I would be ready. But it wasn't just about the notes. I needed a plan, a real solution that would not only stop her from blocking me, but make it physically impossible. The memory of that boom barrier at the hospital parking lot kept replaying in my head. The clean clunk as it dropped. The undeniable finality of it. Nobody was driving past that thing without permission. The more I thought about it, the more I realized why not my driveway. So, I did what any desperate suburban dad with Wi-Fi would do. I fell down the rabbit hole. That night, after Maya had gone to bed, I stayed hunched over my laptop until nearly 3 in the morning. Forums for home security systems, Reddit threads about DIY driveway gates, commercial supplier websites with glossy photos of boom arms guarding warehouses and gated communities. Most people thought about landscaping or repainting their shutters. I was daydreaming about importing airport-level security into my cul-de-sac. Of course, this wasn't just about hardware. If I went through with it, I needed to know the law had my back. I pulled up city ordinances, digging into obscure PDFs about zoning and property setbacks. The language was dense, filled with legalese about structures within the right-of-way and easement access. But the bottom line was clear. As long as my installation was entirely within my property line and didn't obstruct the public sidewalk, I wasn't violating city code. Then came the HOA bylaws, a document that could bore a lawyer into a coma. Fences 3 pages, mailboxes 2 pages, even an entire section on approved paver materials for driveways. But when it came to access control arms, nothing. Not a single word. That was my golden loophole. If it wasn't explicitly forbidden, then technically it was allowed. And believe me, I planned to use every ounce of that technicality. Still, I knew Karen. She wasn't going to back down because of a rulebook. No, she'd double down, call the cops, cry to the HOA, scream, until the walls rattled. If I went through with this, it had to be bulletproof legally, mechanically, and literally in construction. So I started making calls. The first two security companies laughed at me. "You want a boom arm for a residential driveway?" they asked between chuckles. "Sir, this isn't a shopping mall." But on the third try, I found someone who didn't laugh. Riley Park, owner of Secure Entry Systems, a small outfit that specialized in high-end gate automation for wealthy estates. I still remember that first phone call. "Mr. Cole, let me get this straight," Riley said slowly. "You want a commercial-grade boom barrier installed at the end of your driveway." "That's right," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Automatic remote-controlled, with all safety features. I want something that says without a shadow of a doubt this is private property." There was a pause, then a chuckle. Not mocking, more impressed. "Well," he said, "I've done a lot of crazy installs, but this one's a first. If you're serious, we can make it happen." And I was deadly serious. That night, I broke the news to Maya. She stared at me across the dinner table like I'd lost my mind. "You want to put a parking garage arm in our driveway, Ethan? Do you know how insane that looks?" Insane, I countered, as watching Leo miss his championship because Karen treats our driveway like her personal lot. "Insane," is the HOA shrugging while I'm trapped in my own home. This is sanity. This is order." She sighed, rubbing her temples. "How much is this order going to cost us?" I slid the preliminary quote across the table. She glanced at the number, groaned, and shook her head. "Just promise me one thing," she said finally. "Don't make it bright orange. I don't want our house looking like a toll booth." "Fair enough." Over the next few days, Riley and I hammered out the details. He explained the installation, trenching from my garage panel to the driveway, pouring a concrete base wiring, the operator cabinet, balancing the arm-cutting loops into the asphalt for vehicle detection. He promised photo eye sensors to stop the arm if anything passed underneath, pressure sensors to reverse it on contact remotes for easy access. "Basic model or heavy duty?" he asked. "Heavy duty," I said, without hesitation. "Something that says access denied with authority." When I hung up, I couldn't stop grinning. For the first time in months, I felt like I had the upper hand. Karen's entitlement had finally met its match, and this time it wasn't going to be me yelling on her porch. It was going to be steel concrete and motors doing the talking. The installation date was set. Riley promised his crew would arrive at dawn, trucks loaded, ready to turn my suburban home into Fort Knox. I marked the day on my calendar in bold red letters, Operation Barrier. In the days leading up to it, I kept a close eye on Karen. She strutted in and out of her house, oblivious, still treating my driveway like her overflow lot. But soon, very soon, she was going to meet a new reality, one where her oopsie smile wouldn't get her past a 12-foot aluminum arm. And when that day came, I was going to savor every second. Installation day arrived like a small military operation. Dawn had that hard, pale light that made the cul-de-sac look washed and conspiratorial. Riley Park pulled up in a battered truck with a logo that read Secure Entry Systems, and two guys who could have been mistaken for gentle giants, if not for the way they handled heavy steel like it was a child's toy. They surveyed my driveway with the kind of clinical interest a surgeon gives an interesting case, and then they smiled in a way that made me feel we were on the same side of history. First came the paperwork, which felt anticlimactic until I read the fine print about permits and electrical inspections. Riley had already told me what to expect. Dedicated circuit run from our panel conduit buried deep enough to satisfy any nitpicky inspector. A reinforced concrete pad anchored with bolts the size of my thumb, and to my greatest relief, approved UL-rated operator mechanism with built-in obstruction sensing. He explained the induction loop system, thin sawed channels cut into the asphalt that would detect a vehicle's metal mass so the arm wouldn't descend on a car mid-pass. Photo eyes on either side would act like tiny sentries. Break the beam, and the arm would reverse. Redundancy was the operative word. Maya hovered in the doorway, watching the crew unload a contraption that looked like a tiny bridge. Her face was a collage of disbelief, worry, and begrudging amusement. "Please don't make it look like a billboard," she said, folding her arms like a general who didn't want to surrender. "Keep it subtle." I promised to paint it something muted, cherry taupe or fog, beige, something that wouldn't startle the HOA into fainting. Riley gave me a look that said, "We'll make it dignified." Neighbors drifted out like moths to a light. Mrs. Patel, from across the street, filmed on her phone, narrating under her breath like she was doing a live soap opera. Young Timmy, from number 9, rode by on his bike and asked if we were building a secret lair. For once, the neighborhood had something better than recycled furniture and passive-aggressive flyers to gossip about. They trenched a neat line from my electrical panel in the garage under the lawn and to the curb. I felt slightly obscene watching my beautiful grass being violated for the greater good. The concrete truck backed up the mixer word, and they poured a pad so level the gods could have parked a chariot on it. While the pad cured, they assembled the operator cabinet, sleek industrial with a solid feel that promised permanence. Then, like a ceremonial raising, they mounted the 12-foot arm with those classic diagonal red and white stripes that announce "do not cross" in any language. When it swung up for the first time under manual power, there was a satisfying sovereign whir and a little exhale of triumph from every neighbor within range. But the real work was the safety calibration. Riley programmed the travel limits, the obstruction torque thresholds, the photo eye sensitivity, and the exit loop so the arm would open automatically when I drove out. He showed me the diagnostics, a log file that recorded every event, every open, every close, every sensor trip. If anyone accuses it of malfunctioning, we have the receipts, he said, tapping the tablet like a priest sealing a covenant. I liked that. Documentation felt like armor. Word spread quickly. By late afternoon, Karen was outside watching like a panther watching a new fence. Her posture was the same hand on hip lip curled with a familiar cocktail of entitlement and indignation. She approached with the kind of theatrical gasp that suggested she'd caught me erecting a monolith to crush the poor. "What is that abomination?" she demanded, voice pitched for drama. "You can't just... This is the community. You're supposed to be neighborly." I walked up slowly, feeling that strange electric calm of someone who finally had a plan that didn't involve pleading. "Karen," I said, holding my hands up like a man explaining the weather, "this is a private access control installed entirely within my property line. It meets the local code. Riley ran the permits. It keeps you from blocking me in. Enjoy your newfound mobility." Her face did that small, nearly unnoticeable flicker people get when they realize the script isn't going their way. She sputtered something about the HOA, about aesthetic violations, and promised to make calls. She got into her. Camry did an exaggerated three-point turn like a director staging a coup and left like a queen who'd been insulted by a pauper daring to wear boots. That evening, a certified letter arrived like a thrown gauntlet. The HOA's logo graced the top in somber script. Violation notice: installation of non-conforming structure. Aesthetic deviation. Immediate removal requested. Fines would commence in 7 days. My first thought was annoyance. The second was an ugly, triumphant humor. I'd expected precisely this. The HOA, for all its pastoral charm and community potlucks, loved to posture. They loved the semblance of control. The next morning brought the most surreal knock on the door, 2 uniformed officers from the county, looking apologetic for being the grown-ups in a neighborhood of toddlers. Karen had reported the device dangerous and almost hit her car. I showed them the photographs of the excavation, the permit copy, the electric inspection pass, and Riley's diagnostic printout. One officer scanned the log on Riley's tablet and raised an eyebrow. "Well," he said, "it seems manufactured with a hell of a lot of safety redundancy." He was careful with his words. This tends to be a civil matter. If she thinks she was damaged, she can file a claim. But structurally, this doesn't violate anything we enforce. He stamped his approval with a weary nod and left, probably late for a much less dramatic shift. Now the HOA couldn't just be ignored. They called an emergency architectural review committee meeting. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and PowerPoint death. Board members sat in a semicircle like a court, and Karen sat front row center clutching a binder labeled evidence. Their attorney, neatly coiffed and practiced at moral outrage, presented a slideshow of my yard before and after. The images were curated for maximum effect, the arm juxtaposed against a stock photo of peaceful suburbia, insinuating that the value of all our houses would plunge into an economic abyss because of my mechanical taste. I, on the other hand, presented dates, times, emails, and photo logs. I had a binder of my own, meticulous, time-stamped and ugly as truth. I played a clip from Mrs. Patel's cell phone showing Karen moving my traffic cones like a rogue chess player. I handed copies to the board of the police officer's statements, Riley's compliance certificates, and the urban code excerpts that made the HOA's hysteria sound thin. They questioned me in that polite, protracted way committees used to feel in control. "Why didn't you come to us first?" they asked. "Because I did," I wanted to say. "Because you told me it was a civil matter. Because you sent me a form letter about neighborliness when my son missed a championship. Because your bylaws are a labyrinth of petty rules but have a gaping hole where real solutions should be. Instead, I explained the chronology, the safety redundancies, and the documentation. I told them I hadn't acted out of malice, but out of necessity. It wasn't a clean victory. The ARC couldn't immediately order removal. The bylaws didn't give them that teeth without risking a legal quagmire. But they did vote to issue daily aesthetic fines until a resolution. It was a classic bureaucratic tactic, squeeze until surrender. The first notice arrived pinned to my door like a medieval verdict, $50 per day. I thought about folding under the financial pressure. Then I thought of Leo, of every morning my family had been turned into prisoners in our own driveway. $50 a day was a price I was willing to budget into the ledger of reclaiming normalcy. That night after the meeting, Todd Karen's husband shuffled over to my yard while I was testing the arm with the remote up, down, like a man repeating a prayer. He cleared his throat hands in his pockets. His voice was sheepish low. "Look, Ethan, Karen's been difficult," he began. His eyes darted to the boom. "But between you and me, since you put that thing up, we haven't had parking tickets. She used to get notices all the time when she'd block spaces down the street." He shuffled his feet. "If you'd maybe painted a neutral color, I could talk to the board. Maybe get them to ease up on the fines." It was an olive branch disguised as pragmatism. I paused, looked at the arm, at the concrete pad, at the neat trench, and then back at Todd. Compromise is a currency in suburbia. You trade color for peace tone, down the theatrics for the right to breathe. I told him I'd consider it. I didn't promise anything, but I felt something like relief. This war might not be endless. There might be a route out that kept the barrier and bought us civility. I went to bed that night with the device humming softly in my head, the log files a small comfort. The boom arm sat quiet under the stars, a sentinel converted from asphalt and steel. It was ridiculous and glorious. It was also a line drawn in the sand. We had escalated beyond notes and cones into stakes that could not be ignored. The following week felt like living inside a courtroom drama. Only the courtroom was my own driveway, and the gavel was a 12-foot aluminum arm painted in stripes of defiance. Every day I woke up, clicked the remote, and listened to the mechanical whir as the boom barrier swung skyward. That sound was music, a hymn to personal freedom. But I also knew the war was just heating up. Karen's first attempt at sabotage came quicker than expected. Tuesday morning, I watched from the kitchen window as she crept out of her house in slippers, clutching her phone like it was a sword. She approached the barrier, poked at it, tugged at the arm, and snapped photos from every angle. At one point, she even leaned close to the operator cabinet, as if by sheer will she could discover a hidden violation. I half expected her to lick it and claim it tasted like crime. Then she marched off, likely to the HOA president's house, rehearsing her lines. Sure enough, that evening another certified letter arrived. This one cited community aesthetics and the industrialization of a residential environment. They made it sound as if I'd installed an oil refinery instead of a glorified parking arm. Attached was a schedule of fines that escalated like a parking meter from hell. $50 the first day, $75, the second $100 by the weekend. My pulse spiked, but then I remembered what Riley had said. They'll try to fine you into submission. Stand firm. It's a bluff unless they're willing to take it to court. Maya wasn't thrilled when I showed her the letter. She pinched the bridge of her nose, muttering about our savings account. "Ethan, I support you, but we can't pay thousands in fines just to make a point." I kissed her forehead and promised I had a strategy. Truth was, my strategy was a mix of legal research, stubbornness, and blind faith that the HOA wouldn't want to risk a courtroom showdown. On Thursday, Riley dropped by with fresh diagnostic logs and a satisfied grin. "She claimed the barrier nearly hit her car, right?" he asked. I nodded. He held up a printout, every event, time-stamped, every obstruction detected, logged. The data showed the arm had reversed twice that morning, once when I walked under it, once when the UPS guy passed. No record of contact with her vehicle. "This is your bulletproof vest," Riley said, tapping the paper. "If she pushes it legally, you've got proof." That same evening, a crowd gathered as Karen attempted her next move. She pulled her Camry up to the driveway, stopped just short of the lowered arm, and honked. The honk was long, angry, theatrical. When nothing happened, she climbed out, stormed across my lawn, and pounded on my front door. "Ethan," she bellowed, "open this thing. You can't keep me from parking here." I opened the door slowly, remote in hand. "Karen, it's not here. It's my driveway. And yes, I can keep you from parking here." I clicked the remote. The arm lifted smoothly. Then, just as she smirked in triumph, I pressed it again, and it swung down with perfect timing, halting inches from her hood. Her face twisted, half shock, half rage. "You'll regret this," she hissed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "The HOA will bury you. You're violating community standards. You think you're clever, but you're finished. Funny, I said, smiling faintly. I thought burying people under fake standards was your department. She gasped like I'd slapped her, then stormed back to her car, nearly backing over her own mailbox as she peeled away. The next day was the official hearing at the HOA clubhouse. The fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps, and the room smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee. At the front sat the board, Eleanor Voss, the HOA president, flanked by two ARC members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen sat in the front row, binder in her lap. Her husband Todd slouched beside her, looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Their lawyer's slick hair, slicker suit opened with a slideshow. He clicked through photos of my house before and after, painting a picture of suburban paradise ruined by a monstrous industrial barrier. He warned of declining property values, negative visual impact, and a precedent that could unravel community harmony. At one point, he even claimed the arm posed a physical hazard to children. I nearly laughed out loud, imagining Girl Scouts being decapitated by a safety sensor-laden device that reversed when a feather floated by. Then it was my turn. I stood holding my binder of evidence. My voice trembled at first, but anger steadied it. I explained how for months my driveway had been blocked, how I'd begged for help, how I'd received nothing but platitudes about neighborly cooperation. I held up photos, Karen's Camry, Todd's SUV, timestamp dates. I showed the log of 311 calls the police report Riley's diagnostics. This barrier isn't an eyesore, I said. It's a solution to a problem this board refused to address. It's legal, it's safe, and it restores the most basic right of property ownership, the right to leave your home. Karen leapt to her feet. He's targeting me. This whole contraption is harassment. It nearly crushed my car. I turned calmly to Riley, who held up the diagnostic log like holy scripture. No record of contact. Multiple safety redundancies. No evidence of malfunction. Murmurs spread through the room. One board member scribbled notes furiously. Eleanor pursed her lips, clearly torn between loyalty to Karen and fear of a lawsuit she couldn't win. After an hour of back and forth, the board reached its verdict. They wouldn't order the immediate removal of the barrier, too risky legally, but they would uphold the fines for aesthetic non-compliance until a compromise could be reached. It wasn't the win I wanted, but it wasn't a loss either. The barrier would stay. The war was now one of attrition. For the next 3 months, life settled into a tense rhythm. Each morning I clicked the remote barrier rising like a salute and drove out unblocked for the first time in a year. Each evening, a fine notice arrived, like clockwork piling on my counter. Karen adapted by parking directly in front of the barrier on the street, technically legal but spiteful. Delivery drivers were confused, Amazon packages delayed, but to me, it was worth it. My driveway was mine again. Then came an unexpected twist. One Saturday morning while I was mowing the lawn, Todd shuffled over. He looked tired, beaten down by the endless skirmishes. "Look," he muttered, eyes fixed on the grass. "Karen's been intense. But between us, this barrier's actually made things easier. She hasn't gotten a single ticket since you put it up. And honestly, it helps me too. At least now I know where I can't park." I stopped the mower, wiped sweat from my brow, and studied him. Todd wasn't a bad guy. He was just trapped in Karen's orbit like the rest of us. He continued, voice low. "I talked to Eleanor. If you repaint the arm in an HOA-approved color, maybe beige, or taupe, the board might back off the fines. Just think about it." It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing to a peace offering I'd ever get from their household. And he wasn't wrong. The stripes were bold, defiant, maybe too much for a neighborhood obsessed with muted tones and symmetry. That night, I sat with Maya on the porch, watching the arm glow under the streetlights. "Taupe tranquility," I said, trying the phrase on my tongue. She laughed softly. "If painting it beige gets the HOA off our backs, maybe it's worth it." And for the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt since the war began. Hope that this story might not end in endless fines or lawsuits, but in a compromise that let the barrier stay and let us breathe. The boom had been lowered, yes, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to raise it again, this time for peace. The so-called peace talks between me, Todd, and the HOA didn't happen overnight. No, they unfolded like a slow-motion boxing match, with each side circling warily, throwing jabs and waiting for the other to blink first. In the meantime, the fines kept coming, printed on official letterhead, delivered with all the pomp of medieval decrees. $50 a day, then $75, then $100. It was absurd, really. The HOA sent me more paper than the city library, all over a painted piece of aluminum that moved up and down. At first I stacked the notices in a neat pile on my desk, thinking I'd respond to them eventually. By the end of the first month, the pile was taller than my coffee mug. By the end of the second, it looked like a papery skyscraper of pettiness. I joked to Maya that we could probably insulate the attic with violation letters alone. She didn't laugh as hard as I did. The worry lines around her eyes deepened each time she glanced at that stack. Karen, of course, didn't let up. She'd park her Camry flush with the edge of the barrier as close as possible, without technically trespassing, and glare at the house as if daring me to complain. Sometimes she'd stand outside pretending to water her flowers hose pointed limply at the grass, eyes locked on me as I pulled out of the driveway. It was surveillance theater, and I played my part by pretending not to notice while feeling her stare drill holes in the back of my head. The cops came one more time, summoned by Karen's increasingly creative complaints. This time she alleged the barrier created a traffic hazard because delivery drivers slowed down in confusion. The officers arrived with the same weary expressions as before, as if they'd drawn the short straw. Mr. Cole once said, "We're not traffic engineers, but this seems fine." He scribbled notes, shrugged, and told Karen to take it up with the city planning department. She shrieked something about dereliction of duty as they drove off. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Meanwhile, I was playing a different game, legal chess. My lawyer friend Tom Reyes came over one Friday with a six-pack and a grin. "You're going to love this," he said, slapping a folder onto my table. Inside were case precedents, where homeowners fought HOAs over unconventional installations, solar panels, backyard greenhouses, even a guy who installed a medieval-style drawbridge for his driveway. In almost every case, unless the bylaws had an explicit prohibition, the courts sided with the homeowner. "This barrier of yours," Tom said between gulps of beer, "it's unconventional, sure, but it's not illegal. And unless the HOA wants to spend tens of thousands dragging you through court, they'll eventually back down. Trust me, they've got better things to waste money on, like landscaping the clubhouse or printing those fancy violation letters." That reassurance gave me a second wind. When the next HOA letter arrived, demanding immediate removal, I drafted a formal reply dripping with legalese. Tom had spoon-fed me. I pointed out the absence of any explicit bylaw prohibiting boom barriers. I highlighted the device's compliance with city setbacks, electrical permits, and safety standards. And I reminded them politely but firmly that this installation was a direct response to their documented failure to address a nuisance that had persisted for over a year. I half expected silence. Instead, Eleanor Voss herself showed up at my door. The HOA president was a thin woman with sharp eyes and sharper heels, the kind who could make a PTA bake sale feel like a Supreme Court trial. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that could cut glass. "Mr. Cole," she began, voice sweet as spoiled honey, "the board is very concerned about the appearance of your installation. It sets a precedent we simply cannot allow." "Precedent?" I asked, feigning confusion. "You mean the precedent of homeowners defending their property when the HOA won't?" Her smile cracked for a split second. "Surely you understand," she said, regaining composure. "This barrier is unbecoming of Cedar Ridge. It looks industrial." "Funny," I said, gesturing toward the neat aluminum arm. "I think it looks like freedom." We locked eyes for a moment, the tension thick enough to chew. Then she sighed, adjusted her folder, and delivered her ultimatum: repaint the barrier to blend with the neighborhood palette or face escalating fines and potential legal action. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I asked her a simple question. "Tell me, Eleanor, if your driveway was blocked daily, if your child missed something important because of it, and your HOA shrugged, would you call beige paint a solution?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She didn't answer, of course. She just said, "The board will expect your response in writing." And with that, she clicked away on her heels, leaving the faint smell of lavender perfume and bureaucratic menace in her wake. That night, I relayed the encounter to Maya. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "Honestly, Ethan, maybe Todd has a point. If painting it beige makes them stop bleeding us with fines, why not?" I didn't want to admit it, but she was right. Function mattered more than flair. The arm could be taupe, beige, even polka-dotted for all I cared, as long as it kept Karen's Camry out of my driveway. The compromise began to take shape. I drafted a counter-proposal to the HOA. I'd repaint the arm in an approved color provided they cease all fines drop pending violations, and officially recognize the barrier as a grandfathered installation. Tom polished the wording until it gleamed with legal intimidation. The waiting was the hardest part. For weeks the fines kept arriving, the tension simmered, and Karen's glares intensified. But then one Tuesday evening, as I was grilling burgers, Todd wandered over with a sheepish smile. "They're going to accept it," he muttered. "Repaint it, and they'll back off." I looked at him, smoke from the grill curling between us. And Karen, he grimaced. She hates it. But between you and me, I'm sick of hearing about it. If this ends the war, I'll personally buy the paint. For the first time, I felt the weight lifting. Not victory exactly, more like an armistice. A chance to breathe without the constant drumbeat of letters and fines. That weekend, Riley's crew returned with brushes, rollers, and 2 gallons of paint named, I kid you not, Taupe Tranquility. They stripped the stripes, smoothed the surface, and coated the arm until it blended seamlessly with the HOA-approved palette. When it dried, the barrier no longer screamed industrial. It whispered neutral, like every fence, mailbox, and stucco wall in Cedar Ridge. When I clicked the remote and watched the newly beige arm swing upward, I couldn't help but chuckle. It still worked, still blocked, Karen still kept my family free, and if it looked less like a parking garage and more like lawn art, well, that was a small price for peace. But as I stood there in the fading sunlight, listening to the hum of the motor, I realized something important. This war wasn't about paint or fines or even Karen. It was about boundaries, literal and figurative. It was about refusing to let entitlement trample over what's yours. And in that moment, I knew no matter what color it wore, the boom barrier wasn't just metal and motors. It was a line in the sand. My line. If you think the story ended with a coat of taupe paint, you don't know Karen or the HOA. Beige might have quieted the board's shrill alarms about aesthetic violations, but Karen was still Karen, and peace in Cedar Ridge was always temporary. The very first morning after the repaint, I woke early, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and stepped outside just to admire my newly christened Taupe Tranquility boom barrier. Under the soft Arizona sunrise, it looked less like a toll booth and more like an elegant garden feature. I almost convinced myself it was pretty. I clicked the remote, watched the arm rise in a smooth arc, and felt a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. My driveway was mine, and no HOA notice could change that now. But as I drove off to work, I spotted her. Karen standing at the curb in her robe, phone in hand, snapping photos of the beige arm from every angle, like she was auditioning for a crime procedural. She gave me a thin smile as if to say, "You won this round, but I'm not finished." That afternoon, Maya forwarded me an email from the HOA. While the repainting has addressed the immediate concerns of the board, we request continued compliance reviews in the coming months. In plain English, we'll stop fining you for now, but we're watching. Fine, let them watch. I had documentation permits and the law on my side. Still, the tension lingered. I'd won the battle, but I wasn't sure about the war. A week later, the HOA hosted their monthly open meeting. I usually skip these circuses, but something told me I should show up this time. Sure enough, the boom barrier was item 3 on the agenda right after pool gate repairs and community potluck scheduling. I sat near the back while Karen marched up to the microphone binder and hand voice, pitched for maximum indignation. "This barrier is not just an eyesore," she declared. "It's a symbol of hostility. It divides the neighborhood. It endangers delivery drivers, children, everyone." Her words dripped with venom, but I noticed something interesting. Not everyone was nodding along. A few neighbors rolled their eyes. One muttered, "At least it keeps her from blocking him in." Another whispered something about wishing they had their own barrier to keep her out. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. This isn't hostility. This is necessity. For over a year, my family was trapped in our own driveway. The HOA refused to help. The police called it a civil matter. I acted within the law, and I compromised by repainting to meet community standards. If anything, this barrier restored peace, because for the first time we can come and go freely without confrontation. The room was quiet. Even Eleanor Voss, usually stiff as a marble statue, shifted uncomfortably. She knew the truth. They all did. Still, the board wouldn't admit defeat outright. Instead, they kicked the can down the road, scheduling yet another compliance review for the following quarter. Bureaucracy at its finest, stall delay, hope the problem solves itself. Meanwhile, life settled into a strange new rhythm. The fines stopped. The HOA quieted down. And Karen adapted. Instead of parking in my driveway, she parked directly across from it on the street, angled just enough to make turning out more difficult. Perfectly legal, perfectly spiteful. She couldn't cross the barrier, so she found new ways to needle me. One morning, I nearly clipped her SUV pulling out. My patience snapped. I marched across the street, fists clenched, ready to unleash. But then I saw Todd sitting in the driver's seat, not Karen. He rolled down the window, expression weary. "Sorry, Ethan," he said. "She told me to park here. Honestly, I'm just tired of arguing with her." I sighed, the anger bleeding out of me. "Todd, you don't deserve this." He gave a sad little laugh. "Neither do you." That was the moment I realized Todd wasn't my enemy. He was just another casualty in Karen's endless war. Weeks passed. Slowly, the neighborhood's gossip shifted from the crazy boom barrier to other topics: a broken pool heater, Mrs. Patel's dog escaping again, the eternal debate about garbage bin placement. My barrier became less of a scandal and more of a landmark. Delivery drivers got used to it. Kids on bikes started calling it the gate. Even Maya admitted it wasn't so bad once the letters stopped. But Karen couldn't let it go. One evening I came home to find her standing at the barrier phone pressed to her ear, gesturing wildly as she described it to whoever was unlucky enough to be listening. When she saw me, she snapped. "This isn't over, Michael. My name is Ethan," I corrected calmly, raising the remote. The barrier swung upward like a salute, and I drove past without another word. The real twist came a month later. I received an official letter from the city, not the HOA, but the actual municipal planning department. My heart sank as I tore it open. But instead of a violation, it was a survey request. They were reviewing innovative residential access control solutions and wanted to inspect my installation as a case study. Apparently, Riley had bragged about it at a contractors forum, and now the city was curious. When the inspector came clipboard in hand, Karen hovered nearby like a vulture waiting for roadkill. But to her horror, the inspector nodded approvingly. "Meets code, clever solution, safe installation. Honestly, more HOAs should allow this. It reduces neighbor disputes." I nearly laughed out loud at the look on her face. For once, the law wasn't just on my side, it was singing my praises. That night, I poured a glass of bourbon, sat on the porch, and watched the arm rise and fall with each click of the remote. It wasn't just a barrier anymore. It was a victory monument. A reminder that sometimes against all odds the little guy wins. Of course, Karen still glared. She still muttered. She still parked annoyingly close when she could. But the war had shifted. The HOA had lost its leverage. The city had given me tacit approval, and Todd, poor Todd, looked relieved every time we crossed paths. In the end, the barrier didn't just block her car. It blocked her power. And that was sweeter than any fine, any letter, any HOA decree ever could be. For the first time in over a year, Cedar Ridge felt like home again. By the time the city inspector's blessing landed in my mailbox, the HOA's claws had dulled. The daily fine notices stopped arriving, the board meeting stopped listing Cole's barrier as an agenda item, and the neighborhood's collective obsession drifted to other dramas. A couple fighting over solar panels, an argument about whether the community pool should allow inflatable swans. For a few glorious weeks, it felt like normalcy had returned. But Karen was not a woman built for surrender. Her new tactic was psychological warfare. Each morning I'd leave for work to find her. Camry parked nose to nose with the barrier on the public side positioned just close enough to make maneuvering out of the driveway an exercise in geometry. Legally, she was in the clear street, parking was fair game. But practically, she'd turned my morning commute into a stress test. Maya begged me to let it go. "You've already won," she said, watching me fume over Karen's precision parking from the kitchen window. "She's just trying to get under your skin. She's succeeding," I muttered. Leo, meanwhile, thought it was hilarious. "Dad, it's like she's playing chicken with the boom arm. You should just lower it on her hood." I shook my head, but couldn't deny the fantasy had crossed my mind. The barrier had changed the balance of power, but it hadn't ended the war. It had just forced Karen to adapt. Still, I had something she couldn't touch: time. Every day that passed, the barrier became more normal, more accepted. Neighbors got used to it. The HOA, wary of lawsuits, grew silent. Slowly, Karen's complaints lost their audience. Until one humid evening in June when Todd approached me again. He caught me as I was mowing the front lawn, wiping sweat from his brow like a man carrying the weight of two wars, one with me, one in his own living room. "Ethan," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Karen wasn't within earshot. "We need to talk." I cut the mower and leaned against the handle. "What's up?" He shuffled, scuffing his sneakers against the curb. "Look, I know Karen's difficult, but between us, this barrier, it's actually been a blessing. She hasn't gotten a single parking ticket since you put it up. Used to happen all the time when she'd block hydrants or squeeze into illegal spots down the street. Now she can't. Honestly, it's made my life easier too." I blinked. Was this Todd admitting he liked the barrier? "So why are you telling me this?" I asked cautiously. He sighed. "Because the HOA's still grumbling. Officially, they've let it go. Unofficially, Eleanor keeps whispering about setting an example at the next compliance review. I think they're waiting for you to slip up. Slip up how maybe the paint chips. Maybe you forget to file a form. They want an excuse, but if you repainted it again, something softer, less confrontational, they'd probably drop it for good." I almost laughed. "So now they want me to paint it twice." Todd shrugged helplessly. I'm just telling you what I heard. Between you and me, I think they're afraid of losing in court, but they don't want to admit it. Give them a face-saving way out, and maybe this whole thing dies quietly. It was the closest thing to a truce Karen's household had ever offered me. And though I bristled at the idea of bending even further, I couldn't ignore the logic. Sometimes victory isn't about crushing your opponent, it's about letting them think they saved face while you keep what matters. That night, I told Maya what Todd had said. She set down her wine glass and gave me a look equal parts tired and hopeful. Ethan, please, just do it. Paint it beige, taupe, lavender, I don't care. As long as we can stop living like we're in a Cold War documentary. I stared at the boom barrier under the porch light, its taupe tranquility finish gleaming. Maybe Todd was right. Maybe one more concession would finally kill the beast. The next morning I called Riley. How much to repaint, I asked. He chuckled. You're kidding. Again, not kidding. And this time, let's go with desert sand. Whatever matches HOA, beige number 4. He laughed again, but agreed. A week later, his crew showed up with brushes, rollers, and the exact shade pulled straight from the HOA-approved color chart. When they were done, the barrier blended so perfectly with the neighborhood palette, it practically disappeared against the backdrop of stucco walls and cookie-cutter landscaping. Karen hated it. I knew because the first time she saw it, she marched right up to the arm, squinted and screamed across the street. You think this makes you win, it's still ugly. I raised the remote, clicked it, and watched the arm rise like a magician's trick. Still works, I called back, grinning. She sputtered, stomped her foot, and retreated. The HOA, on the other hand, finally relented. At the next board meeting, Eleanor read a dry, formal statement. Mr. Cole's access control installation has been repainted to meet community standards and is hereby recognized as compliant contingent on continued upkeep. In plain English, we lost, but we'll never admit it. And just like that, the fines stopped. The letters stopped. The whisper campaigns fizzled. My barrier wasn't just tolerated, it was legitimized. Grandfathered in, as the lawyers would say. Life in Cedar Ridge settled into a new normal. Delivery drivers learned to pause, wait for the arm, and continue on. Kids on bikes nicknamed it the gate and made a game of guessing whether it would rise in time. Maya stopped sighing every time a letter arrived. Even Leo started bragging to his friends. Yeah, my dad built a boom barrier so crazy the HOA gave up. But Karen, she never truly gave up. She still parked too close. She still muttered when we crossed paths. Sometimes she'd stand in her yard, arms crossed, glaring at the barrier like it had personally insulted her ancestors. But her power was gone. The HOA had conceded. The city had approved. Todd had waved the white flag. The war was over, even if she refused to accept it. And me. Every morning when I clicked that remote and watched the arm rise, I felt something priceless: freedom. Not just from Karen's Camry, but from the suffocating grip of an HOA that thought it could dictate every inch of my life. I'd built more than a barrier. I'd built a reminder that sometimes you have to fight ridiculous battles to protect the simplest rights. That sometimes lowering the boom is the only way to raise your peace. It's funny how a neighborhood can hold its breath without anyone realizing it. For months, Cedar Ridge had been tense, like a violin string pulled too tight. Neighbors whispered the HOA schemed and Karen fumed. But once the arm swung up in its new desert sand, paint something shifted. The tension leaked out of the cul-de-sac like air from a balloon. Life went on. I remember the first Saturday after the truce. The morning sun cast soft light on the boom barrier, blending it into the landscape so neatly you'd think it had been there all along. I sat on the porch with a coffee, watching Leo kick a soccer ball against the garage door, and for the first time in a year, I didn't feel the weight of war pressing down on me. No letters in the mailbox, no cops at my door. No HOA meetings turned into witch trials. Just peace. Karen, of course, couldn't resist one last attempt. A week after the repaint, she appeared at my driveway armed with a clipboard and a tape measure, muttering to herself as she documented the dimensions of the arm. She paced, snapped photos, and jotted furious notes like a detective piecing together a conspiracy. Finally, she marched to the street, pointed at the barrier, and yelled, "This isn't over, Michael. My name is Ethan," I called back, smiling. Then I clicked the remote. The arm rose smoothly, defying her, and lowered again with a satisfying clunk. After that, she retreated. Maybe the HOA's silence had broken her momentum. Maybe Todd finally begged her to let it go. Whatever the reason, her campaign sputtered out. She still glared, still muttered, still parked her Camry suspiciously close on the street sometimes, but the fire was gone. Without the HOA backing her up, Karen was just another neighbor with too much free time and too little self-awareness. The HOA, meanwhile, shifted their attention to smaller, pettier battles, garbage bins left out too long lawn heights, whether patio umbrellas needed to be neutral tones. Compared to the war we'd just fought, it all felt laughable. I even got a violation notice once for leaving my recycling bin visible from the street. I framed it in my office as a trophy, a reminder of how low their bar had fallen. Oddly enough, the barrier made me something of a local legend. Neighbors I barely knew started stopping me during walks, asking, "So how'd you get away with it?" One guy, Mr. Alvarez from 3 streets over, confessed he was thinking of installing a gate of his own after years of dealing with cars blocking his driveway. Another family asked for Riley's number, joking they wanted a coal special for their house. Even the mailman who had once cursed my barrier when it confused him eventually came around. Smart setup, he admitted one morning. Stops people from treating your place like public property. Wish I had one at my apartment building. Leo, of course, loved it most of all. Every time he brought friends over, he'd show off the remote like it was a magic trick. "Watch this," he'd say, clicking the button, grinning as the arm lifted with a whir. His friends gasped, laughed, and begged to try it. I never let them, of course, but I couldn't help smiling. For him, the barrier wasn't just a piece of hardware. It was proof that his dad had fought back and won. One evening, Todd came over again. He had a 6-pack in hand and an apologetic smile on his face. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. We sat on the porch, sipping beers, watching the kids ride bikes up and down the street. "I never said it before," he began, voice low, "but thanks. Not for the barrier exactly, but for standing up to her. She steamrolls me, steamrolls the board, steamrolls everyone. You're the first one who didn't fold." I studied him, saw the tired lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped, as though he carried years of battles that weren't his. "Todd, I said you don't need to thank me. You need to stand up for yourself." He chuckled sadly. Easier said than done. We clinked bottles, and for a moment I felt something like pity. Todd wasn't my enemy. He was collateral damage. Months passed. The barrier became background noise in our lives, just another quirk of our home. I added a small security camera at the entrance, linked it to the barrier so I could open it remotely for deliveries. I even mounted a little sign with a QR code that said, "Call to enter." UPS and Amazon drivers loved it. Maya joked that our house had better security than some embassies. Sometimes when I stood at the end of the driveway watching the arm rise and fall, I thought back to the early days, Karen's smirks, the endless notes, the hopeless feeling of being trapped in my own home. It seemed absurd now, almost comical, but back then it had been suffocating. And I realized something important. This wasn't just about a driveway. It was about boundaries, about respect, about refusing to be steamrolled by people who think rules bend to them. Karen never apologized. I never expected her to. But she stopped blocking my driveway. That, in the end, was victory enough. And every morning as I clicked the remote, watching the arm swing up like a salute to hard-won freedom, I whispered the same words under my breath: access granted. Looking back, I realized the boom barrier wasn't just a mechanical fix, it was a metaphor. Life is full of people, like Karen, entitled, dismissive, eager to take what isn't theirs. Sometimes talking works. Sometimes compromise works. But sometimes you need a barrier clear, firm, unmovable. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. The lesson isn't about concrete or aluminum. It's about courage. It's about drawing a line and saying, "This far, no further." Because if you don't defend your boundaries, no one else will. And once you do, once you stand firm, you'll be amazed how quickly the world adjusts. So to anyone out there dealing with their own Karen, remember this. You don't have to fight dirty, but you do have to fight smart. Know your rights. Stand your ground. And when the moment comes, don't be afraid to lower the boom. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below, share where you're watching from, or tell me about the battles you've fought with your own HOA. And if you want more outrageous, true-to-life tales of neighborhood drama and revenge, don't forget to hit subscribe. There are plenty more battles to come, and you won't want to miss the next one.